So we've been doing Asher War highlights for quite some time. I think we have covered around 22 Asher Wars, and we just hit the 900 subscriber point in the channel. So I figured, you know what? Let's make a tier list. I probably won't be as super in-depth as maybe like other people have done for the tier list. I'm just gonna base it on my experience from the showcases and from trying to, make the videos for it. So I'll be going through the first 22 and we'll do the next 22 in the future, and we'll make a tier list for that in the future as well. So in this tier list, we're gonna have a criteria that kind of like falls within 3 categories. It'll be very very loose in how we address each criteria, but it's good to always have some at the start. So first off is difficulty in landing the hit with the Asher War, how safe is the Asher War, and then lastly, the damage of it. And how we're ranking the Asher Wars will be based on, of course, PvP, because that's what I do for this channel, but it'll also be more focused towards invasions or combat ordeals or united combat. Just a lot of those game modes where there are multiple people that you're fighting against or with. So the very first video that we did for our Asher War highlight was Double Slash. So Double Slash is a pretty good Asher War. You're simply doing slashes horizontally in front of you. There's also 2 extra follow-ups that you could do. And I think the speed of the follow-ups for Double Slash varies depending on your weapon types. So if you have the lighter weapons, they will come out a lot quicker. In general, this Asher War is fairly easy to land, and it's also pretty safe considering how fast the initial part of the Asher War comes out and how quickly it ends. Overall, it's pretty good, and the damage is actually pretty good. If you're doing 2 slices with it, and if you get the follow-ups, depending on if you have status and all that, it could be very good for application. At the very start, this is going to be my first S. I think it's really good. I like to apply it on a lot of my weapons. When I do use various weapons, I like using it. So yeah, right, first one up there. The second one that we did on our showcase was Charging Forth. So I thought Charging Forth will kind of be like how it was in Dark Souls 3. It will all chain together. It'll be very fluid. Unfortunately, or fortunately, in this game, it doesn't really connect as well. There is some difficulty in landing it. For sure, you could probably get the first initial hits, but the main damage output comes from the very last hit, and you're either doing the full charge where you're going pretty far, or doing the no charge version. So I would say this Asher War is fairly okay, or maybe difficult to land fully, because it does have multiple hits onto it. The first couple of hits from the initial charge does do very little damage. It's mostly the last hit where you do get the most damage out of it. But I felt like there were some times when I was using it where you'd get the first initial hits, and then your enemy, depending on maybe poise or maybe you could just roll out of it, it was actually fairly difficult to get the last part, which is the main damage of the Asher War. Next, to talk about how safe the Asher War is. It's fairly safe. You could probably just use it, and then if you think you're not gonna be in a good situation, curve to the side. I know they had a patch where they kind of address this a little bit, but it does take quite a bit of stamina, and it does leave you pretty vulnerable if you do miss. So I wouldn't say it is entirely safe. And then the last point, damage. If you don't land the last part of the Asher War, the damage is very small. Overall, based on all of that, I am inclined to put it as a C. It is not the worst. It does do some good pressure when you do get a roll catch scenario with it, but just the difficulty of landing it fully and how safe it is kind of puts it around here. So next is spinning weapon, and this doesn't mean spinning weapon for the staff carrying Regal Scepter, because that one is amazing. Instead, this Asher War is just you having your weapon in front of you and just spinning in front of you. It actually doesn't go that far from your body, so the range is very small. There are some startup frames for it, and also it doesn't really have a follow-up, so it's not really the best Asher War. It is pretty difficult in landing unless you do trap them in the corner, or you do have a decent amount of poise and they're kind of running into you, or they're rolling to the side of you. And again, it is not the safest. It takes quite a bit of stamina to actually spin it and maintain it if you want to do it. You can't even press it for a long duration to just spin it for a long time. It kind of just stops after a little bit. And the damage is not the best because you could just kind of like get hit by a little bit and then roll away. And you can't really chase them down because there is some like kind of like end lag towards the end of it before you can actually move again. So again, not the best. So this will be our first D right down there. So next up is the Giant Hunt. When you do use this Astral War, you do flip people in the air, kind of like a pancake, and it puts you into like a roll cash scenario on the ground, which is very favorable for the person who actually uses the Giant Hunt. So it's really good. I haven't used Giant Hunt in quite some time, so I know before I like to use it with the Colossal Sword. I think everyone liked to do that before. I haven't had a chance to do that recently, so I don't know if it's still as fluid as it was before. But overall, the damage output of this is really high. And I'll say the difficulty in landing it is pretty good, pretty easy to land. I think especially if you're doing like a hit, put them in like a bad position, and then you kind of use that as a roll catch or a read if they are going to hit you. So overall, I think this will be up here. I like it a lot. I'll put it in the S tier. I do enjoy flipping opponents in the air, does good damage, it's fairly easy to land, and it's fairly safe so you don't lunge forward all the way. Next one, Spinning Strikes. So in my Astral War highlight, I did only use the helicopter part of the Astral War. I didn't use the follow-up, but I did do some practice with it, trying to see like how easy is the follow-up is to connect. But I found that it is still a little hard to land the follow-up, so I am inclined to put it as a C. So if you think it should be higher, maybe let me know in the comments, but I am happy with putting it at a C. It would have been a D if I didn't find out about the follow-up, but I think based on what I tried and my experience, I would put it at a C. So in terms of difficulty in landing the hit, I think it does have some startup frames. Depending on your weapon, it could be like pretty wide based on what you're spinning, and also depends on like whether it's a spear or maybe even a halberd, and it could change how like a poise stance breaks your enemy. But from what I saw, you could probably get 1 or 2 hits, and then usually the enemy is able to just roll away, so you can't really connect a lot more of the helicopter part. And then when you are doing the follow-up, also leaves you pretty vulnerable when you are using it. And also I found that it doesn't always connect as smoothly, so that probably also leads up to its difficulty. And the damage is actually pretty okay. If you do land everything together, you probably get the first 2 hits of the helicopter, and then you do it to the follow-up. The damage is actually pretty good. So honestly, I'm stuck between putting it at a B or C, because I do think it does have its use, but based on my experience, I want to put it at a C. I could put it at a B or C. So for now, I'm just going to put it at a C. Maybe next time I could fix this after doing more practice with it. But for now, it's a C. So next up is Earthshaker. So Earthshaker does fall into that archetype of Astral War where you do use your weapon, slam to the ground, and it will usually have a follow-up after. I think Earthshaker is probably like the most basic one of all the other archetypes of this, but that doesn't mean that it's bad. I do find this to be a pretty good Astral War nevertheless. The range of the ground slam is pretty far, and the follow-up is pretty good, especially if you do delay it a little bit. So the difficulty in landing the hit with the Astral War, I would say it's fairly easy, especially if you are running to the middle of it. It does have a lot of hyper armor, so if you are running in and you are in the middle of your animation, you will get it off, and because of how wide the ground explosion is, it will most likely hit your enemy. And plus the follow-up is a wide sweep, which also makes it pretty easy to get the enemy. And I think the Astral War is pretty safe, provided that you don't always do the follow-up. Just the initial ground slam that you do, it does cover a lot of range. It does have a lot of like stunning potential to your enemies. So if you do it against them, they either panic, roll away because they are afraid of the follow-up or another ground slam that you do potentially do. So it is fairly safe, and the damage, it's pretty decent. So based on all of that, I will put it at right here, right in B. So next one that we're going to be covering is Storm Assault. It's just like the skill from Vike's War Spear, but just without the madness, and uses just wind, storm stuff. So I found that this Astral War is amazing against enemies that don't have a lot of poise. You do get the initial stun from the jump up in the air, which does combo into the ground thrust and the wind box that comes afterwards, which does do a lot of damage. But if you do have high poise, you aren't really stunned by the initial jump in the air, so you can just roll away. So it's pretty difficult to land for people who have higher poise, and depending on what your weapon is, the poise damage of the wind and the jump up and the thrust down, it does vary depending again on the weapon. Because of that variance, and because a lot of people do use higher poise armor, I do find that it's probably not the best. So the difficulty in landing, again, it varies. If you do have someone who has high poise, it'll be very hard. If it's someone with low poise, it's pretty easy. Again, you do need to hopefully trade into it because it does have good hyper armor at our startup frames. So this Astral War is probably not the safest because you are stuck in that large animation. If there's like more than one enemy there and they could just spam magic at you, it's not the safest, but damage is pretty high if you do land all of the parts of the Astral War. So because of all of that, I will put it at a C. So next one is Sword Stance. You're just kind of like spinning forward with your weapon and doing like two slashes, I believe. And it does have a follow-up afterwards. This one is an interesting Astral War. Immediately, I want to put it between A or S because I do like it. Like, it's pretty easy to land because of how many like strikes you do with one sword stance. You do 2 for the initial and then 1 slam down as a follow-up. And because you are going forward, you do cover a lot of range when you are using it. So it's really easy to land it. Of course, if you know how to roll and dodge it, it's pretty easy to dodge, but it is fairly easy to land the hit most of the time. I think the Astral War is pretty safe. You have to respect it when it comes out because of the 2 slashes that come out. So either you're rolling away or you're blocking it. You can't really block it since it does take a lot of poise damage. I also say this Astral War is also fairly safe. If you whiff from misjudging the distance between you and your enemy, then that's probably really bad. But if you're like right in front of your enemy and you do it, your enemy has to respect it and dodge it either to the left and right. And then you have to judge whether do I go in immediately after, because there's also the follow-up that comes out fairly quick. So I'll say it's fairly safe. And the damage is pretty good. If you do land the first 2 hits of the spin, it's pretty good. Then the follow-up, if you do land that, overall the damage is pretty nice. I like it. This is also an Astral War that I'll apply to a lot of my weapons. And I had a chance to use this on many weapon types, and the speed of Sword Stance is fairly similar for all of them, so it's really good for bigger weapons. You could argue for this for being S or A, but because this is my tier list, I would like to put it at S. I like it a lot, and in fact, I want to put it at the very top. I really like Sword Stance, and I'll probably move it like this. Yeah, like that. So again, remember, this is a tier list. Tier lists are pretty biased. And because this is my tier list, it's pretty biased to how I play Elden Ring and how I like to play. But of course, if you do want to talk about it, discourse is always good in tier lists. Maybe I could be persuaded for some of them. And I do like hearing your thoughts about where you might place specific Astral Wars to either higher or lower. Discourse is always good. So let's go to our next one, which is, I think it's Wild Strikes. It is an interesting Astral War. You're just swinging your weapon around you wildly, but it does have a lot of hyper armor, which is insane how much hyper armor you have. In terms of difficulty in landing it, it's actually fairly easy because of how much hyper armor you have. So if the enemies are around you or they're in like a confined area, it is fairly easy to just, swing around, circle around, because you can move when you're actually doing the wild strikes, which is crazy. So you could just hit them. They're just trying to smack you around, but depending on your weapon, you're just flinging them around, doing damage all over. It's just crazy. In terms of how safe the Astral War is, you could stop swinging fairly early. You do your starter frame, swing a little bit, and then stop, then roll. It's actually pretty safe. There is a follow-up for it, and the follow-ups are pretty good. And the damage for it is actually pretty high, especially if you're getting them stuck in the vortex and you do land the follow-ups. So honestly, I like Wild Strikes a lot. Personally, I wouldn't put this as an S. I'll probably put it as an A. That's just how I feel about Wild Strikes, but I do think it's still pretty good. Next up is Stormblade. Stormblade is a pretty good Astral War. You just get your weapon and you just shoot a projectile wind. The damage for the wind is fairly decent. It's not insanely high where it's broken, but it's not like insanely low where it's like not worth using it. It does have its use. So in terms of difficulty, the farther away the enemy is, it is a little harder, but it is a lot easier to land when they are closer to you. Because it's a projectile, it's insanely safe. You can just shoot this from afar, mid-range. You don't have to worry about the repercussions of, of it being too close and doing the projectile. And the damage overall, again, is pretty okay. So I would put this at an A. I like it. I'll probably put it in front of Wild Strikes. That's just how I feel about it. And there you go. Next up is Stamp. I think like the uppercut version, the one where you could also like flip people up like pancakes. So this is an interesting kind of like a two-parter Ash of War, where you do have the first part where you stamp. You do have like kind of like an endure state. And then if you do the follow-up, you could flip people up in the air if you do land it. So the difficulty in landing is that you do need to hope for trades. I think that's one of the main ways to actually land it. But luckily you do have Endure, so you do have an easier way of landing it. I think the Ash of War is actually pretty safe, mainly because you have the option of committing to the follow-up or not. So you could always like judge whether the enemy's gonna come in, and you could just trade directly with the Endure. And if you know how laggy the enemy's move is, you could just always do the follow-up or not. That's where the option select of, enduring only versus enduring and doing a follow-up. So I do think it's fairly safe, even though it could be a little hard to land and very situational. You can't just throw it out all the time. And in terms of damage, it's okay. I think the main benefit of this is just that you put people in the air, you flip people in the air, and you do get them in this scenario where they have to roll away, or if they stay too long on the floor, you can just hit them on the floor. So it puts the enemy in a very bad situation, which is great for us. So I would honestly put this at a B. I like it. I'll leave it there. I decided to split this tier list video to 2 because it kind of like went on to like 40 minutes. So I wanted to split it to 2, it would be more easier to consume. So this will be the first part, and the second part will be next week. So look forward to that. If you did enjoy the video, please leave a like and subscribe. Greatly appreciate it. Catch you next time. So close.